Most supplements won't improve your performance. And even if a supplement does have good evidence, it doesn't mean you should necessarily take it. In this episode, I'm going to talk about what supplements you need to run a better marathon and what supplements you can avoid. Hello and welcome to episode 2 of the Endurance Science Podcast with me, Matt Carpenter. The aim of this podcast is to cut through the noise and misinformation that social media presents us and discuss what the science really says about endurance performance. My name is Matt. I'm a PhD student looking at supplements and dietary changes and how they impact performance. I'm also a lecturer in sports science at the University of Northampton. And in today's episode, we're going broad and hopefully it'll be helpful for multiple reasons. Whether you're already an experienced athlete looking to fine tune your performance and wanting to know what supplements you can take to elevate your performance to the next level, or you're relatively new to endurance exercise, just starting out and you want to know what supplements should I be taking? Because that's what I'm going to cover today. What supplements do you need to take to run a marathon? And I also want to talk about what I look for when I'm deciding whether I think a supplement is evidence-based, how I read research, the things to look out for to avoid misleading marketing, and I'm going to finish with a tier list of supplements. I'm going to tier a number of supplements into 4 different categories: essential, helpful in context, or simply noise. And I wanted to cover this one early on because this is the question I get more than any other question, both on social media and in my day-to-day life. What supplements should I be taking? And it's never an easy answer because everyone's different. And the beauty of these longer form formats is that I can go into those contexts. Where is there evidence for a certain supplement? What is the context where different things may be helpful for different people? And because of that, we can go into the idea that just because a supplement has good evidence, it doesn't mean that you should necessarily be taking it. And so first things first, let's talk about what determines whether something has evidence and the things to look out for. Well, the first thing is some kind of mechanistic plausibility. Is there a clear reason why taking this supplement could improve your performance? On top of that, can you get this supplement through diet alone? So is this a supplement that you could just be consuming through your day-to-day diet, or do you need to add in something, a supplement, to get those mechanistic benefits? And then when we start to look into the research itself, is the research consistent? And are there multiple studies that support the work of the supplement? This is my biggest gripe with the marketing world at the moment within endurance exercise, because there are a lot of supplements that claim to be evidence-based and 95% of them aren't. But they'll find a study here, a study there, a mechanism here, a mechanism there, and say, here's a study that supports our supplement. But it's much more complicated than that. And something that's also very important is just because something works, it doesn't mean you should take it. And there are a number of reasons for that. The first one is the context, which we'll go into with a number of different supplements, particularly some popular ones. And on top of that, a lot of supplements are quite expensive. And just because something works, number one, it doesn't mean it's magic. If it's going to take 15 seconds off your marathon time, is it worth hundreds and hundreds of pounds? For most people, probably no. So we're going to talk about not just what works and what doesn't work, but how well does it work and how much is it going to cost you? And although this is specific to a marathon, really this is going to encompass anything up to a marathon, from your 5Ks really all the way up. I'll cover everything in between as well. And so I want to start with what is essential for a marathon. And in my view, there's only one supplement that is, I would consider, essential for running a marathon. One and only one. It's not sodium bicarb. It's not even caffeine, as much as I love a good coffee. It's carbohydrate. Carbohydrate is the only thing I would deem essential to running a marathon. And what I mean by that is if you're training right now for a marathon, you could go the whole way from now until marathon day and not buy a single supplement outside of carbohydrates, and you would do well, or at least you're in a good position to do just fine. Now, there may be some other supplements that might give you a little edge on top of that, but you're getting 99% of the way there with carbohydrate alone. Now, next week, I'm going to talk about how much carbohydrate you need across different endurance races, from your 5Ks all the way up to your ultra marathons. So if you want to know more about the importance of carbohydrate, then that is going to be a good episode for you. But to talk about briefly, at least, why carbohydrate I would consider essential, particularly for a marathon, is that when we're running, particularly when we're looking at endurance exercise, we're predominantly using fat and carbohydrate for fuel. As intensity goes up, we use more carbohydrate. Fortunately, our carbohydrate stores are finite. They're quite limited. So we have a carbohydrate pool in our liver and a pool in our muscle. We have, on average, around 400 to 500 calories worth of carbohydrate in our liver and 15 to 1600 in our muscle. So we can say around 2000 calories worth of carbohydrate at any given point. Now, this might be a bit low when we wake up because our liver glycogen will be slightly depleted. Our liver is tasked with keeping our blood glucose stable. Our muscle glycogen we hold on to a bit more carefully. And then when we start to exercise, that's where we're getting a lot of our energy from. However, if we've only got 2000 calories of carbohydrate on us at any given point, as we start to exercise beyond 2 hours, and as much as I like to think there's some elite athletes listening to this, I doubt we've got any sub 2 hour marathon runners unless Elliot's here to say hello. If you're running for more than 2 hours in your marathon, then you may be at risk of carbohydrate depletion. This is typically characterized by what people call the bonk, which is very common at around mile 20 of a marathon. Now, that's a similar time that you might expect, if you've not fueled correctly, to be running out of carbohydrate stores. And so, since your carbohydrate stores are finite, then carbohydrate supplementation is important. Now, there's some really interesting nuance to how carbohydrate is working mechanistically. I'm going to cover that in more detail next week. Suffice to say, it might not be as good as we once thought at sparing muscle glycogen, but it is very, very effective at sparing liver glycogen. We'll talk about that next week. But those carbohydrates are going to help you spare overall whole body glycogen. So you're storing carbohydrate better, or holding on to it at least, which is going to help you prolong exercise. It's also going to help you maintain your blood glucose levels, so stop you going into hypoglycemia, that low blood glucose that results in a cascade of negative hormonal reactions. And so carbohydrate, very important. Not very controversial a statement, you might be saying. Agreed. But it gets a bit more controversial when we go into the less essential supplements. And now, I'm not going to talk about every single supplement in the world here, because we'll be here for hours and hours and hours. What I want to talk about are the most common supplements that people talk to me about and that I see when I'm at running events. And I want to talk about the supplements that truly are evidence-based. And there's not many, so we can cover them easily in one episode. Now, again, I'm going to deep dive into each of these as time goes on, but I wanted to start with a nice overview. And one of the big takeaways from this that I hope you get is that you don't have to overcomplicate running. You don't need every supplement under the sun. I'm quite a curious person. I like to try things. If you're curious as well, there's no harm in trying many of these things. But you don't need to spend money that you may or may not have on these supplements. Particularly if you're new to running, some of these might cause more stress in trying to get your timings right and trying to nail a supplement routine, when actually you can get your carbohydrate done properly. You don't need to do much else. But what else has evidence? Well, when we're looking at marathons in particular, slightly less intense than, say, a shorter event, your half marathons and your 10Ks, that's where we can start to look at, are there any supplements that improve our aerobic energy system? So we have three main energy systems that we use for exercise. We have our aerobic system, our anaerobic glycolysis system, so producing carbohydrate without oxygen, and what's called our ATP-PC system. That's our rapid energy system that we might use for, say, a 100-meter sprint. Now, our aerobic system is highly dominant in any event beyond 800 meters. So it covers a huge range of events from 800 meters, 1500 meters, all the way up to your multi-day ultra marathons. And if a supplement can improve that aerobic system, then it stands to reason it's going to improve your performance in those kind of events. And that's where we come to what I would consider the most evidence-based supplement for aerobic performance, specifically when targeting that aerobic system. And that is beetroot juice. Beetroot juice is a vasodilator. So you consume beetroot juice, it's very high in dietary nitrates. And those dietary nitrates act as vasodilators, essentially open up your blood vessels, make it easier for blood to get through. Now, when we're using our aerobic system, we need blood to get to our muscles. That's what we're doing. Again, blood to the muscles. In that blood, we have oxygen. And it's oxygen that is supporting those reactions that are helping us generate energy in the form of ATP. So beetroot juice makes us more efficient at getting that oxygen delivered to the muscles under aerobic conditions. So it works. Magic, right? But not quite magic. Because just because something works, like I've said before, doesn't mean you should necessarily take it. So let's talk about the nuances of beetroot juice. There is good evidence that it improves endurance performance across quite a wide spectrum of events. And the rationale is fairly clear that the aerobic system becomes slightly more efficient. It reduces the oxygen cost of exercise, which is fantastic. But the differences are quite small. The effect sizes you see in most research papers are fairly minimal. So you're not going to see huge differences in your performance. You might see a slight difference. I would contend that most non-elite athletes aren't going to notice a difference from beetroot juice. You will, have better physiology, but it's such a small difference that you might not actually notice it within your own performance. And so it's effective, but it's effective in quite a small effect range. And so for the price of beetroot juice, it might not be for you if you're just starting out now. If you're a well-seasoned endurance athlete, beetroot juice is a great option to try and help take your performance to the next level. Take off, say, 15 seconds off your 5K, maybe take a minute off your marathon time. Okay, the effects aren't huge, but they are there. The next question I get when I talk about beetroot juice is, can I take beetroot juice from a big carton? Can I just eat beetroots, or do I have to take those little beetroot juice shots? And unfortunately, or some people see it as unfortunately, the shots are the best way to go. And the reason for this is that you are getting a benefit from the nitrate concentration within the beetroot. And when you have a controlled amount of nitrate, you know you're going to get that physiological effect. Now, unfortunately, you would need so many beetroots to get enough dietary nitrate to improve performance that you wouldn't be eating anything else, and then some. And unfortunately, again, when you look at beetroot juice cartons, it doesn't have a controlled amount of dietary nitrate, so you don't know how much you're going to be getting, so it might not be enough to improve your performance. Many beetroot juice shots have standardized dietary nitrate concentrations, and that's something you should absolutely look for if you're buying beetroot juice. Make sure on that beetroot juice container, it tells you how much dietary nitrate there is. If they're not standardizing for the nitrates, you don't know if you're going to get the benefits that beetroot juice provides you. And so when you're looking at getting a beetroot juice, make sure you're standardizing, or you're getting it from a company that standardizes for nitrate concentration. On top of that, research is more clear for benefits in non-elite runners. So the better an athlete gets, the less effective beetroot juice tends to be. The reason for that is that you're already optimizing the pathway by which beetroot juice has its benefits. So that nitric oxide pathway is actually one of the adaptations to exercise, enhancing the efficiency of that pathway. However, elite athletes, it does seem, will still benefit from beetroot juice, but they need to consume more. And so the recommendations at the moment are for sub-elite athletes, 400 milligrams of nitrate is sufficient to improve performance, which typically is one shot, whereas elite athletes will need 2 shots to get the same effect. So beetroot juice does have a good evidence base, but it's not essential. These are quite small effects we're seeing. So it's a nice to have, but not an essential. And on this list, you might be surprised to hear there's only one more supplement I would consider a nice to have, good evidence base for the vast majority of people. Everything else then goes into context dependence. There's very few things that I would blanket recommend for most people. And the second one is caffeine. Caffeine works by acting on your adenosine receptors. And so you have receptors that stimulate tiredness. Caffeine is great at blocking those receptors. So it's shaped identically to these adenosine receptors. So it gets in instead of the adenosine and prevents those feelings of tiredness. So it's working directly on the brain, and it can reduce your levels of fatigue. And this has been shown repeatedly in caffeine studies. Caffeine can reduce your rate of perceived exertion, so how hard you find exercise, and therefore improve performance. And again, this isn't essential. And there are 2 reasons for that. The first reason I wouldn't consider caffeine essential is that we're not talking big differences. If you don't consume carbohydrate for a marathon, you're going to go a lot slower than if you do consume carbohydrate for a marathon. If you don't consume caffeine, the difference isn't that large. But again, there is a difference, there is an effect, and caffeine has had a huge amount of research done on it. So we know it can improve performance. The second problem is that there are a number of people that find caffeine has negative side effects, particularly inducing anxiety. Now, if you're lining up at a race you've been training for months and months and months, you're probably already quite anxious. And so if you have a susceptibility to caffeine, that's a hard word to say, then you might find that consuming caffeine is not a good idea right before a race. And this in itself isn't a problem. There's no one correct way to supplement through a marathon. It's all about what works for you within the context of scientific evidence. And so carbohydrates, essential. Caffeine and beetroot juice, helpful, but not essential. Small differences that could be useful. Now I'm going to give you 5 supplements that have an evidence base, but it's context dependent. It's very individual depending on your level of ability, depending on the type of race you're running, and depending on the conditions of the run itself, okay? So we're going to go through these pretty quickly, but hopefully you'll also get an idea of the evidence where these supplements might be beneficial. So maybe they won't be helpful for the marathon you've got coming up this spring, but maybe they will be helpful for something you're planning in the future. And what you'll also see is with these supplements, the evidence gets weaker and weaker. So there's some evidence to support these supplements, but they're not as strong as your caffeines as your beetroot juices and particularly as your carbohydrates. And what I'm going to do is order these in a list of how strong the evidence is for prolonged endurance events. And so the first one is sodium bicarbonate. Now, this is one that's getting a lot of hype at the moment, and for good reason. The evidence supporting the use of sodium bicarb has been around for a long time in short duration exercise. So this doesn't work on your aerobic system like beetroot juice. It actually works by mitigating metabolic acidosis. That metabolic acidosis is predominantly created by anaerobic work, so work without oxygen. And because of that, it's more effective the shorter an event gets. And so there's very good evidence for sodium bicarbonate in 2 to 8 minute exercise bouts. But what's important to note when we look at different energy systems is that we're never just using one. So even when you're running longer distances, you're still using a combination of all your energy systems. You're just predominantly aerobic. And so this is where sodium bicarbonate comes in. It's brilliant at helping buffer some of the byproducts, lots of B's there, buffering some of the byproducts of anaerobic exercise without oxygen exercise, which is your intense exercise, thinking of 400 to 800 meters. And so because of that, those byproducts do still build up in prolonged exercise. And so there's more and more research coming out now suggesting there may be a benefit of sodium bicarb for prolonged events. Now, this is not as strong as the evidence for beetroot juice, as the evidence for caffeine, particularly the evidence for carbohydrate. But there does seem to be a rationale. But here's where the context comes in, and there's a few really important bits of context here. The first one is that the longer an event gets, the less the rationale is for sodium bicarbonate. And so as you get up to a marathon, most people won't need sodium bicarbonate. But who will? Well, this is where it gets important. The higher the relative intensity of your exercise, the more likely bicarb will work. What that means is that the better trained you are as an athlete, the more likely you are to benefit from sodium bicarbonate. Let me give you some context. Your average person running a marathon might run at 60 to 65% of their VO2 max when we look at how much oxygen they're using. That's about standard. Your elite athletes can work at 95% of their VO2 max. And so what you'll see is elite athletes have very high VO2 maxes. They're great at getting oxygen to their muscles, but they're also very good at working at a high percentage of that max for a prolonged period of time. And in these kind of athletes, sodium bicarbonate may have more of a benefit because you're working at higher intensity, you're creating more of these metabolic byproducts. However, for your everyday athlete, say you're a marathon runner running at 65% of VO2 max, sodium bicarbonate becomes less effective. And so we have then a continuum, length of exercise and level of athlete. The shorter the distance and the better the athlete, the more efficacious sodium bicarbonate becomes. The longer the distance and the less trained the athlete, the less efficacious it becomes. And so what you can do then is put yourself on that spectrum. How well trained are you and what is the event you're training for? Moderately trained athlete running a 5K, I would suggest sodium bicarbonate might be a good option. Moderately trained athlete running a marathon, it's probably not going to help. I would only tend to suggest sodium bicarbonate for marathon runners if you are a very strong marathon runner. And the reason really is that the evidence isn't quite strong enough to recommend it for people running at lower intensities. But once you get down to 5Ks, getting much more of those metabolic byproducts, that's when more people would benefit. There are some really important considerations to sodium bicarbonate though. For a long time, it was barely used within endurance exercise. And the reason are the GI issues that come along with it. Stomach upset, nausea, and some unpleasant side effects that might involve you having to go make a toilet stop during your run. Now, this has been partially mitigated by an advancement in technology that allows for, say, your hydrogel technologies like Morton have, reduce the amount it can upset your stomach. And so it seems to be a lot better tolerated with formulations now used by your companies like Morton. However, there is still a risk of GI distress. So it's not something to just do before your race spontaneously without having tried it before, nor is anything. On top of that, you're getting a large sodium load from sodium bicarbonate. And so there's risk there if you're taking it too frequently that you're going to get some negative health effects. Like I discussed last week in the electrolyte episode, if you're consuming electrolytes too much, you might get negative side effects that you get from excess sodium intake. Well, sodium bicarbonate, clues in the name, contains a lot of sodium. So I would be very careful of using it too frequently because of that. I spoke to Stephen Southern recently over Instagram, who's a coach, and he argues, and I agree with this actually, that if you're going to take sodium bicarbonate, you probably want to check your blood pressure and quite possibly other cardiometabolic factors. Make sure that you're healthy before you do it because it's a big sodium load. But the evidence is good. And what you might do, and this is another option for someone looking into sodium bicarbonate, is to use it in and around your hard sessions leading up to a race. You may not want to take it on marathon day, but if you're doing, say, mile repeats, 800-meter repeats, then it can be helpful. But again, I would advise against regular use. I personally would never recommend it more than once every 2 weeks, just because of that big sodium load you're taking in. And on a similar note, beta-alanine paints a similar picture. There's good evidence for beta-alanine improving performance in short duration events, 2 to 8 minutes, for similar reasons to sodium bicarbonate. Now, they work differently. Beta-alanine is the rate limiting step in carnosine, and carnosine is an intracellular buffer. So it helps buffer those hydrogen ions, just like sodium bicarb does it in the cell rather than out the cell. So you have a similar rationale, but to be honest, less research in prolonged endurance events with beta-alanine than you have with sodium bicarbonate. And so I recommend beta-alanine for people doing short duration events, 2 to 8 minutes. I very rarely recommend it for anything beyond that. And again, this is one where you might want to take during a hard training block if you're doing a lot of high intensity or interval work, but there's no evidence for benefits at the moment, particularly looking at long duration exercise. And so here the context is important, and I wouldn't recommend for anyone doing things beyond around 8 minutes. So up to maybe elite athletes running a 3K, you might get some benefits, but beyond that, I'm likely to get too much from beta-alanine. And I'm going to go through 3 more context-dependent supplements: creatine, taurine, and electrolytes. I can't stop talking about them. So let's go straight to electrolytes now, because if you watched my episode last week, you probably have a good idea where I'm going with this. If you're performing in the heat or for longer than 4 hours, electrolytes may well be useful. So that would mean if you're running a marathon in beyond or more than 4 hours, or you're running it in hot conditions, you may want to make sure there's some sodium going into your drinks that you're consuming during a run. But if you're not running in extreme heat and you're not running for prolonged timeframes, then there's little to no benefit from electrolyte supplementation. And the research here is very weak for performance benefits unless you're in the heat or going for a long time. If you're going for 4 hours and beyond, it's really important to make sure you're getting your sodium in. But if not, then especially in the UK, you're probably okay. Again, like I mentioned last week, last year's London Marathon was quite hot. So if you are in hot conditions, get a little bit in. But again, when we talk about electrolytes, actually the only thing you need is sodium. The potassium and the magnesium for performance itself aren't relevant. Next up, we've got taurine. And I think taurine is actually a really underrated supplement because barely anyone talks about it. Taurine has some fairly good evidence that it improves exercise in a specific context. And that context, again, is in the heat. So if you're considering taking electrolytes, you may also want to consider taking taurine. This will be taken pre-exercise. Taurine is very helpful when it comes to thermoregulation. So when you're exercising, your core temperature goes up and up and up. Taurine is good at slowing down that rise. Now, that rise may well not impact performance in most conditions, but when you're exercising in the heat, that is going to be a limiter on performance. And so there's pretty good evidence, there's meta-analyses supporting the role of taurine in improving performance in hot conditions. So if you're performing in the heat, you can use taurine just straight before exercise, 1 to 6 grams. There doesn't seem to be a dose-dependent effect. So I would stick at around 4 grams, but there doesn't seem to be too many differences between lower and higher doses. But taurine, half an hour before exercise in the heat is helpful. But again, that's the context. If it's not hot, there's minimal evidence it's going to improve performance. There is research on taurine in normal conditions, but there's not enough evidence yet to support its role. And finally, we've got creatine. Creatine is everywhere at the moment. I can't get away from creatine. Now, creatine's been in gym communities for years. Evidence stemming from the 1990s supported the role of creatine in improving gym performance and improving muscle growth. And the same mechanism for that is the main reason people are now starting to use it within the endurance world. We always come back to energy systems, and I will do a standalone episode at one point on energy systems because they're so important. I mentioned 3 energy systems: aerobic, anaerobic glycolysis, ATP, PC. Creatine impacts that final system, the ATP PC system. It increases your phosphocreatine stores. Phosphocreatine stands for PC. So you might have 10 seconds worth of energy in that system. It's a very high intensity explosive system. Hence you're using it at the gym, you're using it for your 100-meter sprints. You might get 1-2 more seconds worth of work done if you're consuming creatine. So why is that relevant to endurance performance? Well, 2 reasons. The first one is that it might support some kind of end burst or end sprint. If you're, say, going up a hill, if you're a cyclist, or if you're at the very end of a half marathon or maybe even a marathon, if you have that slightly increased ATP PC store, it might improve performance. Now, as you can imagine, that is small fry, possibly not even seconds you're taking off there, tenths of a second that you might be being saved. And there are negative effects of creatine as well when it comes to endurance performance, particularly increased body weight. Creatine increases your water content, therefore you're slightly heavier, which might have a negative impact on your VO2 max. Absolute VO2 max stays the same, but relative goes down because you're heavier, and so your relative value goes down slightly. Research to date tends to show no impact of creatine on performance, and so it's likely that the pros and cons essentially mitigate each other and you just get no impact on performance. But with that no impact on performance, there is another potential mechanism that creatine can help, and that's both improving recovery and helping support the strength gains if you're working out at the gym to try and improve your performance as well. And so when you're going through heavy training phases, you might get recovery improvements from taking creatine, and you might get better adaptations to strength. And so there's a decent case for supplementing creatine throughout training, particularly as training gets more intense. There's little reason to supplement as you get to performance itself. So creatine might have an effect. If it does, that effect is small. However, there are potential benefits, mainly in training rather than in performance itself. Again, context dependent here, because if your training load is quite low, and if you're not doing strength training, then you're reducing the chance that creatine is going to have an effect. And so again, higher trained athletes who are putting in higher volume are more likely to benefit from creatine than, say, athletes that are fairly new to endurance exercise. And so what we have there is a long list of supplements that may work in certain contexts. We have caffeine and beetroot juice that have good evidence, but aren't essential. We have beta-alanine, sodium bicarb, taurine, electrolytes, and creatine, all of which might improve performance, but the evidence is quite limited. And then almost everything else won't improve performance. So what's important to note with these context-dependent supplements is that the evidence is good for, say, your sodium bicarbs and your beta-alanines in short duration events. But when we're looking at marathons, all of these come under the idea of might improve performance. And so do I recommend these actively to endurance athletes? Well, it's context dependent, but typically no. I start with recommending carbohydrate and then beetroot juice and caffeine if the person doesn't have negative side effects from caffeine. And then I would only recommend anything from that latter list if there is a contextual factor that would deem it appropriate. So, for example, if someone has a high training load, I would suggest creatine because the evidence is fairly weak, but at worst, it's going to have a neutral effect. And so we've got a possible benefit. At worst, it's neutral. When it comes to electrolytes and taurine, it really comes down to the environment someone's exercising in. If you're out living in Dubai, running in extreme heat, well, then these two things, your sodium in particular and your taurine, are probably going to be really helpful. If you're here in the winter in the United Kingdom, well, you probably don't need to think twice about them. And so it's not that they do or don't work. It's about the context and the level of evidence. Now, there are other supplements that I would consider potentially important. If you're looking at micronutrients, then you are looking at things like vitamin D, vitamin K2 as well alongside it, that most people don't get enough of, particularly in the winter. That might improve performance as well. I would consider this more of a health than a performance type supplement, which is why I don't talk about it actively, but likely still beneficial. But outside of that, there's nothing with clear evidence that is going to improve your performance. I get asked about so many different supplements, and I could cover honestly hundreds. But anything I've not just named doesn't have great evidence, or the context is so specific that it's not worth talking about in a video that is quite general. So there are things that I've done videos before on things like mushroom cordyceps or any functional mushrooms, of which the evidence is so limited that it's absolutely not worth recommending. The same with things like greens powders, where the evidence is suggesting minimal improvements in health, let alone performance, and the list goes on and on. Most supplements don't work. And I've given you, in a fairly short video, a fairly comprehensive list of the ones that do. And even the ones that do, they only work in a specific context. And saying that, the only one that I said you definitely need, which is carbohydrate, doesn't mean you even need a special supplement. You don't need a carbohydrate gel. You can get carbohydrate through gels, through drinks. For all I care, you can get them through Haribos and Jelly Babies. It's whatever works for you to make sure you're getting in carbohydrate particularly. And we'll talk about the nuances more next week. But it's important to know you don't need to spend all your money on supplements. I will talk next week about how you can home make your own carbohydrate drink for a fraction of the price with minimal difference in performance. And so most supplements don't work. And even the ones that do, you may well not need. Now, what I haven't really mentioned here are recovery supplements. So things like tart cherry juice, New Zealand blackcurrant extract, ketone esters, things like that. The reason is that I'm going to do a whole separate episode on using supplements to recover. But I'll give you the TLDR right now if you're still listening, which is that recovery supplements, even the ones that do help recovery, of which there are some, are going to improve performance by a very small amount. And again, will fall under that context dependent category. Again, if you're an elite athlete where recovery is really important, then you might get that extra 0.1%. But for most people, you won't see a difference. So I will cover those in a separate video. It's a really interesting topic. I think exercise recovery is super interesting. But it's important to note that most supplements are hype, not evidence. What I'd love to cover soon is how supplement companies use science to mislead. I call it science washing. And it's something that gets me more annoyed than anything else. But it's also something that I think is really important to look out for, because nothing frustrates me more than seeing a company pretend to be evidence-based and frankly not being. People often say to me, I've had students say it before, and it's a really important point. They can say, you can find a study to show anything. And the sad truth is that I agree. You can find a study to show hundreds, thousands of supplements can improve performance. But one study tells you very little. And it's important to take the whole research base to inform whether something truly is evidence-based. And that's something I'd love to talk about more in the future. But I think for now, we've spoken for long enough about the supplements you need. And hopefully you get the idea. You can just use carbohydrate and perform just fine. You might get slight benefits from adding in caffeine and adding in beetroot juice. You might get tiny, tiny benefits depending on the type of exercise you're doing, the length, the level of athlete you are, and the conditions you're performing in from a number of other supplements that I've mentioned. But what I really want to talk about and push on this channel is that critical thinking aspect of endurance. My main goal with this podcast is to get critical thinking front and center of the endurance community, not taking people's claims at face value, because it's very hard to get a truly unbiased source of information when it comes to particularly supplements and ways of training, ways of eating within endurance exercise. That's what I want to bring to the endurance running community. And that's what I've tried to do in this very broad video on what supplements do and don't work. And so I hope you found this interesting. I really enjoyed doing this longer content. So if you're still listening, I really appreciate it. And please follow this. Please share it with your friends and colleagues. And if you've got any suggestions on future content, then let me know. I'm really excited to continue this podcast and continue to explore both performance nutrition, supplementation, and training. What I'd like to do in future is start to bring on some people doing some fantastic research in this space. One of the reasons I'm so passionate about science communication is that I see so much brilliant research going on within academia, and a lot of it doesn't get taken out into the real world. People don't know it's happening. And so I'd love to use my platform to help share what's going on in the world of science, both in endurance performance, but also in exercise physiology and health in general, to give everyone listening a good idea of what's happening at the cutting edge of science, particularly in the United Kingdom, because there's so much going on. And next week, I'm going to talk about how much carbohydrate do you actually need during a marathon or a half marathon. So stay tuned for that. I look forward to seeing you there. Thank you very much for listening.